The storm had been beating against Jonah Reed's ranch for nearly an hour when he heard a horse screaming inside the barn. Jonah grabbed his lantern and revolver and stepped into the rain. The barn doors were swinging wildly in the wind. His cattle were restless, kicking at their stalls. Then he saw the stranger. A man lay behind a stack of hay, soaked from head to boots. Blood darkened his coat and one hand pressed against his side. Jonah rushed toward him. "Who are you?" The stranger opened his eyes. For several seconds he stared at Jonah as if he were looking at a ghost. Then his lips moved. "Mary." Jonah froze. Mary was his wife. The stranger whispered her name again. "Mary Reed." Jonah's hand tightened around the lantern. "How do you know my wife?" The man tried to answer, but his eyes closed. Jonah carried him into the farmhouse and laid him beside the fireplace. He sent his hired hand, Caleb, to fetch the doctor from the nearest settlement. But before Caleb left, Jonah searched the stranger's coat. He found a silver pocket watch. Jonah recognized it immediately. It had belonged to Mary's father. A watch Mary had once told him was lost forever. Jonah stared at the dying man beside the fire. For 5 years he had believed he knew everything about his wife. Now a stranger had crawled into his barn carrying a piece of her past, and Jonah suddenly wondered how much of his marriage had been built on a lie. The doctor arrived before midnight. The stranger survived the night, but barely. His name was Thomas Bell. He was a former railroad guard who had been traveling west when 3 men attacked him near the mountain pass. When Jonah asked why he knew Mary, Thomas refused to answer. Instead, he looked at Jonah and said quietly, "You shouldn't have married her." Jonah stepped closer. "What does that mean?" Thomas coughed. "She never told you about the fire." "What fire?" Thomas looked toward the window. "The fire that killed your brother." Jonah felt the room become cold. His older brother Daniel had died 6 years earlier in a barn fire. Everyone had believed it was an accident. Daniel had been checking the cattle late at night when the barn caught fire. By the time anyone reached him, it was too late. Mary had been the last person to see Daniel alive. Jonah had never questioned her story. She had told him Daniel was drinking, angry, and careless with the lantern. Thomas looked back at him. "That wasn't an accident." Jonah's voice dropped. "Who started it?" Thomas closed his eyes. "Your wife knows." The next morning, Jonah found Mary in the kitchen. She was standing beside the stove, making coffee as she had done every morning for 5 years. But when Jonah placed the silver watch on the table, her face lost all color. "Where did you get that?" "In my barn." Mary stared at it. "Who was in your barn?" Jonah's silence answered her. Mary sat down. "Is he alive?" "For now." She covered her face with both hands. Jonah had expected anger. Instead, he saw fear. "Tell me the truth, Mary." She whispered. "I wanted to." "For 5 years?" "I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of losing you." Jonah stepped away. "You already lost me when you decided I didn't deserve the truth." Mary began to cry. But before she could explain, a gunshot cracked outside. The window shattered. Jonah pulled Mary to the floor. Another shot struck the wooden wall. Thomas tried to stand. "3 men," he whispered. "They found me." Jonah looked through the window. 3 riders waited beyond the fence. One of them wore a black hat and carried a rifle. Jonah knew him. Silas Vane, the wealthiest ranch owner in the valley, and the man who had once wanted to marry Mary. Jonah had never understood why Mary rejected Silas. Now the pieces began falling together. Jonah loaded his revolver. "Stay here." Mary grabbed his arm. "Jonah, don't go after them." "Why?" "Because Silas isn't the one you should fear." Jonah stared at her. "Then who?" Mary looked toward the hallway. "Daniel." Jonah felt his heart stop. "My brother is dead." "Yes," she whispered. "But he wasn't innocent." Mary finally told him everything. 6 years earlier, Daniel had discovered that Silas was stealing cattle from smaller ranchers and using forged land papers to take their property. Daniel planned to expose him. But Daniel had also been involved. He had taken money from Silas before realizing how dangerous the man was. Mary discovered the truth and confronted Daniel. That night the barn burned. Daniel died. Mary found evidence showing Silas had ordered the fire. But she also found something worse. Daniel had left behind a ledger proving that Jonah's own brother had helped Silas steal from families across the valley. Mary had hidden the ledger because she feared Silas would kill Jonah if he learned the truth. Jonah struggled to breathe.
All these years you let me believe Daniel was a victim.
He was your brother, Mary said. I couldn't destroy his memory and destroy you at the same time. You should have trusted me. I know. A floorboard creaked behind them. Thomas appeared in the doorway. He was pale but standing. I can prove everything. He held an old leather satchel. Inside was the missing ledger. Thomas had been the railroad guard who transported evidence for a federal investigator years earlier. Silas had learned about the ledger and sent men after him. Thomas had escaped with the evidence. He had come to Jonah because Mary was the only person he trusted to identify the names inside. But there was another name in the ledger, Silas's, and beneath it was the name of the man who had helped him, Daniel Reed. Jonah stared at the page for a long time. His brother's name was there in black ink. The truth hurt more than any bullet, but it also explained everything. Silas had not come for the ledger alone. He had come to erase the last witness, Thomas. Jonah looked toward Mary. What do we do? Mary wiped her tears. We stop running. That afternoon, Jonah rode into town with Thomas and Mary. They went directly to the courthouse, but Silas had already arrived. He stood inside with 2 armed men and a land judge who owed him money. Silas smiled. Jonah, you should have stayed home. Jonah placed the ledger on the judge's desk. I think you should read this. Silas's smile disappeared. The judge opened the book. Page after page revealed stolen cattle, forged deeds, payments, and names of men Silas had bribed. Then Thomas stepped forward. I witnessed the original transaction. Silas reached for his gun, but this time the town was watching. The families Silas had robbed filled the courthouse behind Jonah. One by one, they recognized their names. A farmer whose land had been stolen stepped forward. Then another. Then another. Silas suddenly realized he was no longer facing one cowboy. He was facing an entire town. He lowered his hand. You think this proves anything? Jonah looked at him. It proves my brother was guilty. Silas laughed. So you're willing to destroy your own family? Jonah's eyes hardened. I'd rather lose the lie than live inside it. The judge ordered Silas's arrest. His men surrendered when they realized the town had turned against them. Silas was taken away, but justice did not make Jonah feel victorious. That evening he returned to the ranch alone. He walked to the old burned barn. Only blackened stones remained. Mary found him there. I know you're angry, she said. I am. I know you may never forgive me. Jonah looked toward the sunset. I don't know what tomorrow feels like yet. Mary lowered her eyes. I'll leave if you want. Jonah turned toward her. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Jonah said, I don't want the woman who lied to me. Mary's face fell. Jonah continued, I want the woman who finally told me the truth. Mary looked at him through tears. I am still that woman. I know. Jonah reached for her hand. But trust won't return in one night. I'll wait. Behind them, Thomas stood near the fence. He smiled quietly before turning his horse toward the road. Jonah called after him. You saved my life. Thomas shook his head. No, your wife did. Jonah looked at Mary. Thomas added, she spent 5 years carrying a truth that could have destroyed her. That takes a different kind of courage. Then he rode away. Months passed. The old barn was rebuilt. Jonah repaired the fences, restored the cattle pens, and began turning the ranch into the home he had once imagined. Mary helped him. But something had changed between them. They no longer pretended that love meant hiding painful truths. They talked. They argued. They forgave. And slowly trust returned. One evening, Jonah found Mary's father's silver watch sitting on the porch railing. She had cleaned it until it shone. You should keep it, she said. Jonah shook his head. It belongs to you. Mary smiled. I thought it belonged to a past I wanted to forget. Jonah took her hand. Maybe it can belong to the future instead. The sun disappeared behind the mountains. From the rebuilt barn came the quiet sound of horses moving through fresh straw. Jonah looked at the place where he had found Thomas dying months earlier. He had thought that stranger arrived carrying nothing but danger. Instead, he had brought the truth. And Jonah finally understood that. Sometimes the hardest thing a man can survive is not betrayal, loss, or even grief. Sometimes it is discovering the truth about the people he loves and choosing After everything, whether there is enough love left to begin again,